Well, today is the 6th of December, 2013, St. Nicholas Day. And that means it's just after the end of Michaelmas term. Now, in Michaelmas term, I gave a set of 6 lectures on Marxism, and they were videotaped, and they're going to be made available. However, for technical and organizational reasons, it wasn't possible to tape the very first lecture in that series of 8. So the organizers have asked me to give a kind of summary of the first lecture so that the series will be in some sense complete, and I've agreed to do that. So this will not be the first lecture in the series in the proper sense, not a 55-minute lecture. It'll just be a 15-minute summary of the main points that I made in the first lecture so that you can get some continuity to begin with the other lectures. Okay, I have 2 things I want to say. One is something about the nature of the subject matter that I'm going to discuss in the lectures. And the second is something about how to approach the subject matter. Now, you might ask the question, why is this called Marxism rather than, for example, the philosophy of Marx? What is the subject matter? Is there actually a single subject matter there? And what is the nature of that subject matter? And I want to suggest that there are at least 5 completely different, well, not completely different, 5 distinct but related kinds of topics that you could reasonably and justifiably study under the term Marxism. And I'd like to say a little bit about those 5 different subjects to begin with. The first thing, of course, is you could mean by Marxism the empirical theories, an empirical study, a historical study of the theories that a certain German philosopher and economist developed during the early part of the 19th century. So you could take Marx as an actual figure in history, and you could look at the views that he actually propounded. And of course, there, if you assume that Marx was a real human being and not, say, God the Father, he will be an empirical person like other people. That is, he will change his views, he will develop his views. Sometimes he won't be completely clear, sometimes he won't be a master of all the implications of everything that he says at a certain time. Sometimes he might even contradict himself. So the first kind of study of Marx could be simply a kind of intellectual, philosophically structured intellectual biography of this particular man. What did he think? Why did he think it? How did he change his mind? What did he see? What did he fail to see? What are the contradictions in his views? What are the parts of his views that are undeveloped? Which are sharp? Which are not sharp? So that's a perfectly legitimate subject of inquiry. However, precisely because Marx was a human being and therefore changed his mind and sometimes contradicted himself and sometimes simply wasn't clear about the implications of his views, there's another way of approaching the subject of Marxism, which is to say, look at Marx, as it were, not as a historical figure with changing views, but look at Marx as propounding something like a doctrine, having something like a set of philosophical views that we can study in relative abstraction from the changes in his views about these things. And so you can take the views that Marx developed and you can look at, as it were, not the way in which they changed over his life, but you can focus on the most plausible central set of views that he had, even though they're not the views that he held in every particular moment in his life. So you can focus on the ones that seem most promising, most interesting, and you can reconstruct them in a completely and fully, as fully rational a way as possible. So you can do what philosophers sometimes call a rational reconstruction of Marx. That is, you don't simply describe what he saw, what he didn't see, how he contradicted himself, how he changed. You look at the central view, the central important, fruitful view that you think he had, and you try to make that as consistent and as fully elaborated as possible. And then you study, for example, the way in which that view might be plausible, the ways in which the view might not be plausible. Now, of course, there are some problems with this rational reconstruction approach. One is that, notice what I said was, you take the views that you think are most fruitful and most plausible, and you reconstruct the system around that. Now that, of course, presupposes that we have a single perspective from which we can say what are the most plausible parts of the theory. And we have criteria of what counts as a fully elaborated theory. Now those criteria that we have, so that's something that we would bring to this rational reconstruction. We take the material that he presents and we would impose upon it, to some extent, our order. We would make it better by the criteria that we hold for something being better. Second, so it might be that you could have a number of different rational reconstructions of his views. You might have an early view, and you might think in the early period he had some ideas that were particularly important. You try to make them coherent and elaborated and supported. He might have a later view. So in a number of different ways, the task of giving a rational reconstruction is very different from the task of giving a kind of intellectual biography or a historical account of what he actually thought. So in a rational reconstruction, you might attribute to him even views that he didn't hold, because you might think they are the natural or logical or consistent implications of things that you think he holds. Okay, so that's the second way of approaching. And as you know, this tradition of doing a rational reconstruction of a philosopher has a long tradition in philosophy. A lot of people do rational reconstructions of Kant. They don't tell you all the sorts of things that Kant thought at various times. They focus on what they take to be the central intuitions presented, say, in the Critique of Pure Reason or in the Critique of Judgment, and they try to reconstruct the whole thing rationally and around that. Now, however, there's a third way of thinking about Marx. So there are two ways of thinking about Marx. One as an empirical figure who has an intellectual history that can be described, and the second as the propounder of a set of views that can be seen to have a kind of coherency, or made to have a certain kind of coherency and a certain kind of plausibility. Now, the third way of thinking about this is to think of Marx as what people sometimes call a conceptual revolutionary. That is, think of Marx not as an empirical person, and think of him not as propounding a doctrine, which was more or less plausible, but think of him as initiating a tradition of thinking about the world in a particular kind of way. So you can say, and if you think of him as initiating a way of thinking about the world, and you add to that he himself was very keen on the historical nature of knowledge, then you might come to the view that the right way to think about this is not to look at what the 19th century thinker Karl Marx actually thought, and not to extract a rational reconstruction of what he thought in the 19th century, but to look at the end of that tradition, to look at where the tradition had come to, and to give an analysis of Marxism which would not be a rational reconstruction of his particular thoughts, but the culmination of the development of that tradition of thought. So a kind of contemporary version of what Marx was trying to do that would be maximally plausible, maximally coherent, and would include intellectual developments that came after him. So you might think of that on analogy with Darwinism, right? One task would be to see what Darwin actually thought in the 19th century, but you might also think that Darwinism didn't stop, as it were, with Darwinism. There was a history of Darwinism which led on to the 21st century, and so another way of studying Darwinism would be not to study the thought of Darwin, but to study the thought of Darwinism now, as it were, a way of thinking about the world that is most well supported and consistent given what we know now. So you might think about Marxism in that way too. Now, that's a third way of thinking about Marx. Marxism. Now, the fourth way of thinking about Marx and Marxism is also historical, but it's slightly different from the third. The third thinks about Marx as having initiated a tradition of thinking about the world, and that tradition being both cumulative and continuous. It leads to something else. Another way of thinking about it is that Marx founded a certain development, and there are a number of people who called themselves Marxism after Marx, but the relation of the relation of those people to Marx wasn't the relation of a scientist working in a single scientific paradigm so that there's a kind of cumulativity, but rather there were a variety of influences. So lots of people called themselves Marxists, but there was a plethora of different versions of Marxism. There wasn't, as it were, a main line, as there might have been a main line of Newtonism or a main line of Darwinism. There was just a plethora of different sorts of people. And so a fourth way you could think about studying Marxism would be to study the thought of Lenin, the thought of Gramsci, the thought of Adorno, the thought of Lukács, the thought of Bernstein, the thought of Kautsky. You could study the history of these people without either talking about a rational reconstruction of what Marx thought, or assuming that they were all part of a single coherent cumulative development. A lot of them were deviations from each other. There might not be, as it were, a single mainline development. That still might be something you might want to study. As it were, you might think of Marx more like a series of projects for understanding society than as a scientific tradition that had a cumulative mainstream. And that's a fourth thing that you can study. You could study Kautsky and Lenin and Adorno and various other people. That's a fourth way you can think about it. Now, the fifth way is that Marxism, it's extremely important for Marxism, of course, for most forms of Marxism, that Marxism is not thought of as being merely an intellectual doctrine. It's not thought of as being a mere conjunction of theoretical propositions. It's thought specifically it's thought specifically as a way of thinking about the world where the application of that way of thinking about the world is part of what it is. There isn't, as it were, Marxism and then its application. Marxism is to be thought of somehow as inherently intended to be applied, so that the application is not a separate and distinct and external thing, but is part of the project. And as you know, in the 20th century, a number of so therefore, it's important to think about, one way of thinking about Marxism is it's not, as it were, something to be rationally reconstructed in the way in which we rationally reconstruct Kantianism, but it's something that we look at if you want to understand it, look at the proof of the pudding, which is the eating. Look at what actually happened in the actual societies that presented themselves as being Marxist. So there's another way of thinking about Marxism, which is don't look at the work of Marx, look at the reality of the DDR or the Soviet Union or the Polish People's Republic or Yugoslavia or one of these things. Look at the reality of that. If you want to know what Marxism is, look at that, the reality of that. And that's the thing to study. Or alternatively, you can say there are two things to study there. One is you can study the ideology of these things. You can study the constitution of the DDR, that is what they said about what they were doing. And then you can study the reality of the application of those things. And that will be something that you can study too. So now what I want to say is that these 5 different approaches, none of them is inherently illegitimate. There's a place for all of them. They're not completely disconnected from each other. You can't understand the constitution of the DDR or the Polish People's Republic without understanding something probably about the views that Marx had. So there's some connection. They're not completely different things, but they're not the same things, and you're not approaching the material in the same way. So now the question arises, if that's the case, well, what way am I going to approach it in this set of lectures? And there I want to say, I want to try to do two things. I want to say that I'm closest actually to this, to the second of these, that is to the attempt to give some kind of rational reconstruction of the views of Marx. But I also think that there'll be kind of double focus in these lectures. I'll give, roughly speaking, two rational reconstructions. One of an early position, which is a position in which Marx talks about ideology at great length, talks about alienation at great length. So there'll be a first reconstruction of a kind of view, social critical view that's oriented around alienation. And then there'll be a second reconstruction of a somewhat later position, which will be focused around the idea of a social formation, forces of production and relations of production, and surplus value and the extraction of surplus value. So it'll be closest to that, but I'll try to say something about the other, about some of the other things too. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that if you approach this material, really, the best way to approach it is to forget everything you know about philosophy, and particularly the more you know about analytical philosophy, the less, and the more you find that plausible, the less easy it's going to be for you to make any sense of this, because this is a kind of, Marx was a kind of thinker who belonged to a completely different intellectual context. If you think there's a mainstream, if you think of a mainstream and there are deviant counter streams, he belongs to a stream which has turned out now not to be the mainstream. It's a stream in the 19th century that got started with the successes of Kant and went on for a bit, but was basically trounced in the 20th century. And it's important to see that the people in this subordinate stream had their own views, and they were very different from the mainstream views that you're likely to find. As you know, Marx was by training a historian of philosophy. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on ancient materialism, on Epicurus and Democritus. So he was very, very aware of the history of philosophy, and he was very aware in particular of the history of materialism and of the history of changes in the philosophical culture. And now he talks again and again about what he calls the old philosophical culture, and then there's something else with which he would only call the old philosophical culture old because he was tacitly contrasting it with something else, which is his own. He doesn't quite call it the new philosophical culture, but I'll call it the new philosophical culture. So there's an old philosophical culture and there's a new philosophical culture, and the old philosophical culture you can think of, roughly speaking, as another way I'll talk about it is the 18th century. So there's the old philosophical culture, there's the 18th century, there's, roughly speaking, the Enlightenment, and then there's this new philosophical culture that Marx thinks he belongs to, which is not continuous with the old culture. It's different. And so, and now the thing that makes it difficult is that what I and Marx call the old philosophical culture, the culture of the Enlightenment, which finds its culmination in Kant, gets resurrected by Frege and his associates at the end of the 19th century, and is the origin of analytical philosophy. So what I call the old philosophical culture, or the 18th century, is also what you would think of as the mainstream of analytical philosophy. So if you're trained as an analytical philosopher in Cambridge at the turn of the 20th to the 21st century, you'll have, as the natural kind of assumptions you'll make, views that Marx would think of as the discredited old views of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. So that's an important thing to see. Now, remember, I'm working with ideal types here. That is, I'm trying to describe some general attitudes and approaches, and I'm going to give some examples of them, but you have to distinguish between the general ideal type that I'm setting up and particular individual people. They aren't all the same. I mean, not all idealists believe the same thing, not all materialists believe the same thing, but still you can make some kind of generalizations, ideal, typical generalizations about them. So first I'd like to talk about what the 18th century culture, the old philosophical culture was, and then I'll talk about how Marx belongs to this new culture that is different from that. And now Marx thinks that the old philosophical culture is characterized first by an emphasis on the human individual. So there's an emphasis on the idea that it's human individuals who are important. They are both morally, they both have moral primacy, and they have epistemological and indeed metaphysical primacy. So we start from the notion of a human individual, and we construe this human individual as essentially animal rationale. That is, an entity who has reason, but that means an entity who is a cognitive creature. So central is the idea that you get from Descartes that human being is a res cogitans, a thinking thing. So we start from the idea of individuals and the idea of individuals as thinking entities. And then, in general, you think of these thinking entities as having an inside and having an outside. There's an inside, which is a kind of internal chamber, or it's sometimes called a theater, or a computer memory, or something that's inside the human individual in question. And then there's an outside world. And the inside is, roughly speaking, accessible to me by some kind of reflection and has some kind of priority, some kind of epistemic priority. I can know what I think, what I'm thinking, and my knowledge of what I'm thinking about is somehow close to me and simple and immediate and transparent, and somehow I can do that by reflection. And then the question is, what's the relation of that internal realm, the realm of my internal representations, and the world outside? And that becomes a problem. Then furthermore, you start from these human individuals and then you put them together into human societies, and you build up human societies by construing human societies as collections of individuals. Then furthermore, the assumption is, this is a deeply seated assumption, Marx thinks, in the older views, that you can study human thought and human nature ahistorically, that somehow the human mind has a structure that's not changeable or not significantly changeable, and that structure can be an object of thought, and can be an object of thought in its own terms, and it can serve as a kind of basis for going on to other things. So, and you can study that structure independently of the structure of the society the person lives in, the language the person has, etc. And now Marx says, so therefore you can see why, if you have this older view, this 18th century view or Enlightenment view or view of analytical philosophy, there'll be two variants that will be plausible to people. One variant will be a variant that puts the proposition and the sentence and logic in the center of philosophy. You'll think that the human mind is basically a cognitive machine, and as such a cognitive machine, it works through propositions. And so Marx won't be surprised when Bertrand Russell says, ethics is not about living the good life, it's about the truth of propositions. Or when he says, really every philosopher has a theory of the proposition, and you have to start, if you want to understand the philosopher, start with the philosopher's theory of the proposition. So that's one way in which this traditional old-style thought can go. The other way in which it can go is not through the proposition, but through human psychology. Some view that we all have some psychological similarities, and the cognitive processing is the same and can be studied, and then similarly too, that psychology is a freestanding thing. You can get some grip on the world through studying that, and you can move from psychology then to something else. Okay, so that's what Marx thinks is the old way of thinking about things. He also thinks it's characteristic of this old way of thinking to be ontological, to think about questions of what the real world holds as being central. Now, contrary to that, Marx stands in a tradition that comes from Herder and Humboldt and Feuerbach and other people, which has a completely different structure. And I think the best way to understand the motivation for this is to think about Herder's criticism of Kant. Herder points out that Kant has no treatment of human language. If you look in the Critique of Pure Reason, the term language does not ever occur. Kant speaks, and Herder thinks this is also characteristic of this whole old tradition, Kant speaks as if propositions were just mental entities that were there, and putting them in language was a kind of secondary phenomenon. That you can talk about concepts independently of talking about the language in which the concepts are embedded. You can talk about propositions without talking about the specifics of the language in which these things are embedded. And Herder says, this seems to me to be false. Any kind of study of human language. Human language must take place, human thought, human cognition, human thought must take place in the context of language. We don't have concepts without language. The crucial thing about human concepts and human cognition is that it's embodied in a language. And then, Herder says, and if you take this seriously, one of the immediate implications of it is that individualism can't be the right way to think about the human world, because language is inherently a social phenomenon. So to say that my thought, any form of cognition, has to be a form of cognition that's embedded in a language, and then to say that a language has to be something that I share with other people, that automatically means that you have to have a more socially aware starting point for philosophy than traditional philosophy did. So you have to start with the idea of something like what Hegel calls Geist, that is some notion of a shared language. And a shared language then, Herder and other people go on to say, means a shared history, because empirical languages all have the properties they have by virtue of their history, and you can therefore only talk about it if you talk about their history. So language is essentially a social mechanism, and furthermore, it's essentially a social mechanism that is connected with forms of human action. That is, you can find in all of these people the kind of proto-late Wittgensteinian idea that you can't understand. So all of this is, the late Wittgenstein comes back to some of these ideas, but it's important to see they were there in the 19th century too. So the idea is, if language is not just a kind of representational bubble in my head, but if language is inherently a part of a social interaction that I'm engaged in, and that means that the practical aspect of a human society becomes at least as important as the more strictly cognitive aspects of human society. So you don't start with the individual thinking thing who's thinking in his bubble without it being important what language he's thinking in. You think of a language and a social group as a group of interacting people who are acting with one another, acting on one another, acting against one another, and language is a particular historically constituted form in which that social group actually maintains itself. So a human being, then, he thinks, is not a representing creature. He's not a res cogitans. He or she is rather essentially a social agent, an agent who has, and this is important, an agent who has powers and needs, socially mediated powers. For example, the power to speak is socially mediated. I wouldn't have it if I didn't grow up in a particular society, and I wouldn't have the particular power I have if I didn't grow up in the particular society I grew up in. So the human being is not a cognitive subject. He or she is to be understood as a social actor in the context of a society who has needs and powers and uses those powers to satisfy needs. So therefore, Marx thinks, in the new way of thinking, that is not the old way of thinking, but the new way of thinking, history is essentially what we have to know about. So at the beginning of the German ideology, Marx says in this very famous passage, we recognize only one science, the science of history. Now, to say we recognize only one science, the science of history, doesn't mean that there is no such thing as geology. What it means is the final framework for putting everything is not going to be logic, it's not going to be psychology, it's not going to be physics, it's going to be history in some, certainly the human final thing is going to be some history, and within that historical framework you might, for various purposes, decide to focus on certain things, but that will be a decision you'll make for particular reasons to focus on a particular dependent part of the historical story. So you can talk about psychology, you can talk about propositional things. All of those things are abstractions that you make for particular reasons from the real science, the thing that puts everything in its right perspective, which is history. So anyway, they're the two things that I wanted to make. So when you read this book, always read it as talking about individuals and groups interacting with each other. So this is not saying the central thing is not the individual, it's the group. This is a view that tries to overcome that very dichotomy and to say the only thing to understand is individuals and groups in their interconnection with each other. So, as Hegel said, Geist is an I that is a we and a we that is an I. That is, the English language doesn't exist independently of individual people who speak it. So if we all stopped speaking English, English wouldn't exist. So there's some way in which there have to be individual agents who activate this thing. But on the other hand, you're never going to understand the English language just by looking at some individual speaker of that language, because part of what it is to be speaking that language is to be engaging in an appropriate kind of social relation with other people. So you've got to have, so the idea is the central unit is neither the individual nor some kind of abstract society, but it's the individual in society, and that's the crucial thing. And that's what Marx thinks it was unable for the older philosophers to understand, and that of course is the view that this older view is the one that gets reestablished at the end of the 19th century when everybody begins to say, we have to go back to Kant, we have to go back to Kant. Go back to Kant means forget Herder, Humboldt, Hegel, all of these people, Feuerbach, and forget the social and historical context within which these questions have to be asked. Okay, that's all I have to say about that.